Good afternoon and welcome to Mental Health Challenges During the Pandemic and Beyond, Mitigating Risk for Students, Faculty, and Staff. I'm Jennifer Dahlquist, Vice President at the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, and I oversee MEC's programs of assurance, which include our MedCare Student Health Solutions Program, as well as our Master Property Program. At the end of the webinar, we will be providing a survey link for your feedback, so please do take a minute to complete that survey, as your feedback is valuable for future programming. The past 2 years, higher education has faced incredible challenges responding to an unprecedented pandemic. These challenges cast a brighter light on the mental health struggles of students, faculty, and staff. The JED Foundation's work shifts the culture and conversation around mental health by focusing on a public health approach to promoting positive mental health and reducing suicide and substance misuse among teens and young adults. Today's webinar will focus on current mental health trends on college campuses, the impact of the pandemic, risks posed to students, faculty, and staff, and suggested strategies for mitigating risk. Learn about effective ways your campus can support students, faculty, and staff in managing mental health during this challenging time. I am honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nancy Roy. Dr. Roy serves as the Chief Clinical Officer of the JED Foundation and is Assistant Clinical Professor at the Yale School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry. She has over 20 years experience as a psychologist working in college mental health. She served as the Assistant Dean of Health and Wellness at Sarah Lawrence College, and most recently was the Associate Dean of Health and Wellness at Rhode Island School of Design. Dr. Roy earned her BS degree from the University of Rhode Island, an MS from the University of North Carolina, and her ED from Harvard University. I hope you find today's webinar engaging, and please add questions using the Q&A box, and at the end of the presentation, we will work through all of your questions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thanks for having me today. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm Nancy Roy. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at JED, and hopefully we will be able to have enough time at the end to have an engaged conversation. I welcome your comments and your thoughts. Next slide. Just a couple of minutes to talk about JED, since I assume some of you may not be aware of the JED Foundation or what we do. So the JED Foundation is a nonprofit whose mission is to promote positive mental health and well-being among teens and young adults, with a goal of helping to reduce suicide and substance misuse among our teens and young adults. On college campuses and high schools is primarily where we focus. We were founded about 22 years ago by a couple, Donna and Phil Satow, whose son Jed died by suicide when he was in college. And when they went to the institution where he was to meet with the administrators, they asked Phil and Donna, what would you have us do? We're a large school, 20,000 plus students, what should we be doing? They very genuinely, what should we be doing? And of course, 21 years ago, there wasn't certainly the emphasis or attention to suicide prevention or mental health on campuses. We've certainly moved the needle in that regard. Not to say there still isn't a long way to go, but 21 years ago it was a very different story. And it very much motivated Donna and Phil to start the foundation. They wanted to do something in this space. So they started the foundation, and I would say originally with a pretty narrow focus on suicide prevention, like narrowly defined, but soon learned that if you want to move the needle on suicide prevention or serious substance misuse, you really need to move the needle upstream and focus on prevention and positive mental health. And so that's really the bulk of our work, is working with campuses across the country on how to promote positive mental health and support the emotional well-being of our young people, hopefully so that they don't reach, or we can at least reduce those numbers of students that reach the level of risk that ultimately can bring harm to themselves. Next. So what are we talking about? Next slide. I'm sure this data, doesn't come as much of a surprise as I know you focus on risk on your campuses, but the data that we have is showing that our young people are not doing well. And of course, the pandemic has exacerbated things, as I'm sure you've been reading in the news. But the data showing that 2 out of 3 students are feeling overwhelming anxiety, half are too depressed to function. And by that, we mean, getting out of bed, getting to class, going to the dining hall, getting work done, etc. Binge drinking regularly, 1 in 3. 1 in 8 abusing prescription drugs. This is one that I like to call attention to, because even though it's not as high as some of the other data points that we'll be talking about, it certainly is worrisome given the opioid epidemic in our country. When we work with schools, they almost always tell us that marijuana and alcohol are the 2 most misused substances on their campuses, but prescription drug abuse is on the rise. And we are hoping that schools will really begin to focus on this and get ahead of the curve before we find ourselves having this issue rise even further on our campuses, as it has in our society. 2 out of 5 struggling with food insecurity. I always wonder about this data point because I think it's probably been the case for a while, but we just haven't been looking at this data point. I think food and housing insecurity is something new that we're now looking at. I think we used to think that if kids were in college, they didn't have these insecurities, when in fact, many of them and their families do. 1 out of 3 witnessing race-based discrimination. Again, a data point that I don't think we've been asking about in the past, and certainly has, come to the fore, given the racial turmoil and divisiveness and hate crimes that we've all been witnessing in the past couple of years. 1 out of 3 having serious thoughts of suicide. So not just passing thoughts of not wanting to be here, but serious thoughts of suicide. 1 in 10 engaging in self-injury. That's things like cutting, burning, engaging in high-risk behaviors. 115 a day attempting suicide, pretty significant number, and 1,400 dying by suicide. And yet we know that on average, typically around 12, maybe 15% of students are seen at their campus counseling center if you have one on your campus. But what we find often is the case that the students who are most at risk are often the ones that don't present. They don't present on their own. They may be presented to the health or counseling center in a moment of crisis, but they're not coming forward on their own. And we also know that of the students who die by suicide, most of them did not have any contact with their counseling center. So they weren't known as a high-risk individual on their campus. Next. So as I mentioned, the pandemic has certainly made things worse. This is 2020 data from American College Health Association and the Active Minds group, which is a student advocacy group. As you can see here, 2/3 of students reporting financial stress, many reporting that their families have lost jobs, they've lost jobs. Many feeling worried about getting the virus, somewhat for themselves, but more worried about family and friends, parents, grandparents, and the like. Many had been reporting much more difficulty in accessing care. And this is likely due to the fact that for students who had been being seen on their campus by a mental health professional, and then went home, if they went out of state, they oftentimes could not continue to do teletherapy, for example, with their provider. Because let's say they went to school in Kansas, but they lived in Connecticut, their provider was licensed only in Kansas at the school, but not necessarily licensed where the student was now residing in Connecticut. So because of licensure rules, the practitioner couldn't practice across state lines. And it made it very difficult for students to have continuity of care when they were being seen on campus. In addition, many students reported that when they went home, it was also more difficult to access care in their community. Some family members were less supportive of psychotherapy. Students lived in communities where perhaps there wasn't access to care for many miles away. So at a time when people really needed it the most, there was less access to care. So sort of a double whammy there. As you can see here, skyrocketing increases in stress, anxiety. That we doesn't come as any surprise. I'm sure we all had an increase in stress and anxiety. Lots of disappointment and sadness about missed milestones, whether it was graduations or proms or end of year celebrations. Lots of missing out on internships, things of that nature. As we hear from the Surgeon General, loneliness is at an epidemic proportion in our country, and the pandemic certainly exacerbated loneliness for our young people. And having a significant difficulty maintaining a routine. And this, was very much due to the fact that at home, for some of our young people, they may have been living in crowded conditions. They may not have, access to a private space to do work, getting adequate rest. So having, high-speed internet access. So a lot of difficulty happened in mental health struggles exacerbated by the pandemic. Next. More on the pandemic. We talked about most of these with the financial stressors, really a lot of worries about paying tuition and other academic fees. And just to note, as I'm sure you're aware, specific populations tended to be more negatively impacted. These include students of color, students from lower socioeconomic statuses, LGBTQ students, especially for those who maybe were able to come out on campus but had not come out at home and then were suddenly back at home in perhaps a non-welcoming environment for their situation. Significant medical issues. There were a host of populations, specific populations that were disproportionately affected. Next. So I'll talk a little bit about our model and our approach to working with schools. And this is just some initial data that we have about opportunities that our work so far has revealed on college campuses about things that perhaps they're not quite doing as much as they should be or could be, and the increases that we're seeing as they work with us. So for example, not having mental health as part of the strategic plan for the college, not having a strategic plan for mental health for their students and what they're doing, actions they're taking, gaps they may identify, and goals that they have formulated to fill gaps. Very, very few having as you can see, 71% not having any strategic planning process, not doing environmental scans for access to potentially lethal means. And this one is of particular interest, I think, especially for you all in the audience, around examining your campus environment for areas on campus where students may be able to bring harm to themselves. So for some of you, certainly firearms is what is usually first that comes to mind when we think about lethal means. And depending on where you're located, whether or not you have concealed carry, whether or not you allow firearms on campus, etc. But in addition to thinking about firearms and policies around that, looking at doing an environmental scan of your campus to identify areas where students might be able to bring harm to themselves. For example, in your very tall buildings, if you have them, do the windows only open, a few inches? If you have, garages, do you have barriers or fencing? Is there tall buildings that may have rooftop access? Do you have key card access only? Are there locks? Security systems, cameras, patrols, places like atriums, bridges, known areas on your campus where students could potentially bring harm to themselves, and how are you securing them? In what ways? Obviously, you're not going to construct barriers everywhere that there's a potential for bringing harm to oneself, but thinking about a variety of ways. How do you store toxic chemicals, whether it's labs or medications, things of that nature? So doing an environmental scan, very few were doing environmental scans. Not having task forces to lead a strategic plan, if in fact one was developed. Very less than half having policies about coordinating with families when a student is at a high level of risk and may need to be separated from the college. How do you deal with that with families? What are the policies around that? More than half not even asking about mental health history on incoming health forms. So not knowing, the population that's coming in your doors and living on your campus that may well be at risk or potentially at risk. And health services, slightly under half, screening for mental health in the health center. We know, for example, that far more students use their health center than will ever use their counseling center. So if we're not screening for mental health in our health center, we are potentially missing a lot of students who may otherwise fall through the cracks and potentially escalate to points of crisis and high risk. Next. So in addition, I always feel bad when I start out these presentations because all the news is bad. It feels very depressing, but I hope to pick things up in a few more slides. Of the schools that we work with, 71% had at least one suicide in the past academic year. And 23% had multiple. And I'm sure you've read in the paper recently the numbers of schools. It seems like every other week we're hearing about a school that had 4 suicides in a semester or 3 in a year, etc. 78% of the schools reporting at least one attempt, and almost a quarter reporting 7 or more attempts. And by attempts, we mean that leads to needing medical attention. And 70% reporting at least one psychiatric hospitalization, but many schools have multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. Next. So what do we do? This graphic depicts our comprehensive approach to promoting mental health and preventing suicide among our colleges and universities students. And I'll just preface by saying that the model is an evidence-based model, that the only one that we know of, and it actually was developed by the Air Force about 20 or so years ago. And we, of course, have adapted it and modified it for use with college students. But the Air Force found at the time a statistically significant reduction in suicides among their soldiers when this model was implemented systematically and was sustained. I probably for another day could talk about, why it is that we continue to see high rates of suicide in the military, if in fact they're the ones that generated the model in the first place. And I can tell you that by and large, it's due to inconsistent implementation, which is really unfortunate, but that's a talk for another day. What was interesting about their findings was not only did they find, they were focusing on suicide prevention, a statistically significant reduction. They also anecdotally found, even though they weren't looking for it, of statistically significant reduction in domestic violence and substance abuse. So with those, promising findings, we took the model and adapted it for use with teens and young adults. And so you'll see that there are 7 components to the approach. And I'll say that they're not written here, but there are 2 underlying principles that really are the foundation of our approach. And those are, first, that the responsibility for supporting student mental health needs to be a campus-wide responsibility. We need to take a public health approach on this issue on our campuses. And secondly, we need support from senior leadership. We work on about 400 plus campuses now across the country. And we found that if those 2 things are not in place, support from the top down and campus-wide approach, you really don't move the needle in any kind of long-term systemic way. So with that as our sort of guiding principle, if you will, you can see here the components of the model. So the first is fostering connectedness and belonging. We know certainly our first years on our campuses report that their largest struggle actually is loneliness. And again, I mentioned a minute ago, the Surgeon General, continuing to report on loneliness being an epidemic in our country, and our students are feeling it, certainly impacted by the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, really struggling with loneliness. So the first component is thinking with campuses about how are you fostering connectedness and helping students feel a sense of belonging on your campus. What kinds of programs, for example, do you have in place? Do you have sort of, big brother, big sister kinds of programs where an upper class person may sort of be a mentor to a first-year student? Or do you have opportunities for like groups to gather, veterans, for example, or other groups that have, share an affinity to develop a sense of connection and belonging? Do you have places on your campus where students can gather organically, just to chat or watch a movie or whatever, play a video game? But thinking about how you are deliberate about fostering a sense of connectedness and belonging. We also look at identifying, here it says identifying students at risk, wondering, figuring out how to notice when someone is in distress. I hesitate at the at-risk part. I'd like to change that wording to say identifying when someone might be beginning to struggle, because we don't want to wait until a student is at risk or in crisis before we reach out, right? We don't want to wait until they're, breaking down in your office. We want to help educate everyone on campus to notice when someone might just be beginning to have a struggle. So if I'm a faculty member, for example, and Nancy's usually really talkative in class, and I noticed that for the past couple classes, she's been kind of quiet. She hasn't been as engaged as she normally is. A little light bulb goes off in my head, like, I wonder what's up with Nancy. At that moment, to reach out and say, hey, Nancy, I noticed you've been quiet lately. Is everything okay? What's going on? It's that warm hand, that sort of gentle outreach from someone who is organically in the student's world that can go a tremendously long way in helping the student feel supported. I mean, the notion is to try and create a culture of caring and compassion on your campus where there's no wrong door for a student to walk through for support, whether that be a coach, a security officer, an academic advisor, a faculty member, a dean, you name it. And so really working with schools to educate everyone on the campus on how to identify if someone's struggling. And we know ourselves in our own personal lives. If we see, a family member or a friend that just seems off, it's our natural inclination to say, is everything okay? That's what we're really asking people to do. Unfortunately, I think, I should say, and certainly if a student reveals an acute issue, to know where your resources are on campus, who to call, how to get them the help that they need. But more often than not, it is that offer of support that sort of, it's deliberate but casual, very organic offer of a warm hand, a gentle word that can truly make the difference, and oftentimes mitigates the concern in a way that it doesn't escalate to the point where a student may in fact need professional or clinical intervention. So I think unfortunately many of the training programs that are out there focus on, they're way too clinical. They focus on suicide. They focus on almost needing to know if someone's anxious, depressed, like you need to be a clinician to do this work. And understandably, non-clinical people recoil at that, as well they should. It's not what we should be asking people to do. We should, however, be expecting that everyone on campus has their eyes open, and if you will, pardon my borrowing this expression, when they see something, say something. And then the next is increasing help-seeking behavior. I'm happy to report here some good news that our young people, for our young people, stigma is actually on the decline. I'm not saying it's gone, certainly, but it is on the decline. So more young people are much more open in talking about their mental health struggles, and reaching out for help, which is great. One thing here that often helps, there are certainly still populations, where there are cultural norms that, look down upon speaking about mental health challenges. In this case, it can be helpful to have, and I'm sure you've seen a lot more of this in the news, what people are calling influencers, talking about their own mental health struggles, whether it's an actor or an actress or a sports figure, a famous athlete. If there's folks on your campus, a beloved professor or an administrator, or, not necessarily just talking about their struggle, but as a role model, talking about, how they came through. Here they are, successful, productive, engaged people. So increasing help seeking, looking at services. So certainly looking at mental health and substance use services on your campus. Do you have a triage system to catch those students who actually may be in an acute state and need immediate help? The last thing you want is for a student to call or walk into a health or counseling center and be told that, there's a 2-week wait, without first having at least had, a preliminary conversation to identify whether or not their need is an acute risk. And if so, knowing how to get them the immediate help that they need, whether it's on or off campus. So looking at your triage system, the variety of services you offer, the hours of day that you offer it, screening and primary care, as I mentioned, collaboration between the counseling and primary care center. There's a lot of stuff here that we look at in terms of providing direct clinical care. When students go to the emergency room for alcohol or drug overdose, what are your policies like? How do they support students and focus on prevention? So lots of stuff here. And then in crisis management, here we're looking a lot at your policies, your medical leave policies, your return from leave policies, your mandatory leave policies. When you do have someone who is at serious risk, how do you manage that? What do your policies and protocols look like? How do you engage caregivers or whoever the emergency contact people are? And then I probably should have started with developing life skills. We have found that most of our schools are telling us that their students tend to be arriving on campus with fewer and fewer life skills. That resilience seems to be at an all-time low. And so looking at what you have available on your campus, whether it's in your library, in your counseling center, in classrooms, in athletics, where on campus are you incorporating life skills? Things like conflict resolution, learning to live with people who are different from you, dealing with disappointment, your normal things like time management, test taking anxiety, things like that. But the others more on I guess I would call them interpersonal effectiveness skills. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, looking at restricting access to lethal means, which I talked about via the environmental scan. So these are the components of our comprehensive approach, and as I said, taken from the Air Force model. And if implemented consistently and systematically, has shown to move the needle on promoting mental health and reducing suicides and substance misuse. Next. So this is sort of a Cliff Note version of our JED campus program. I'll go quickly through this. We start when we work with the school by building an interdisciplinary team to work with us, and that is consistent with our philosophy, right? And that it's a campus-wide responsibility. So we like to have folks from, faculty, students, athletics if you have it, Greek system if you have it, your usual student affairs suspects, health, counseling, disability, res life, the dean's office, some are from the provost's office, president's office, security, you get the gist. The team then takes a JED assessment, which is, as I just went through the wheel, those domains, those 7 domains, there's questions in each of those domains. So it will say, do you have this, this, this in life skills? Do you have this, this, this in connectedness throughout all of the domains? Most schools tell us by the time they finish that JED assessment, they have a pretty good idea of where they're doing well and where their gaps are. And at the same time as the team is taking the JED assessment, they administer the Healthy Mind Study to their students. The Healthy Mind Study is out of the University of Michigan, and it is a national survey of students' attitudes, awareness, and behaviors around mental health. And so we've worked with the Healthy Minds folks to map our theory of change. That is, the things we think you ought to see moving the needle systemically as a result of your work with us, to specific modules and specific items on the Healthy Mind Study that map to those changes, because we want to be measuring, as we're affecting systems change over time through your work with JED, what is the impact on student outcomes? Because we can affect systems change all day long, but if we're not measuring the impact on students, how do we know if what we're doing is having the desired effect? So I'll give you one example. If at time 1, your students are saying, gee, I wouldn't know the signs of struggle in a friend, or I wouldn't know what to say or how to intervene, or I wouldn't know where to send them on campus for help. With that data, equipped with that data, and we now are focusing on that with the team, at time 2, we should see very different responses to those same questions. If we're educating students on these issues and really doing a good job in that regard, those responses should be significantly different at time 2. So the data is collected. We write a very extensive feedback report citing where you're doing well, where not so much. We come to campus and spend the day to go through that report and really deep dive with the team to try and get a sense of, at the end of that, having a strategic plan that's going to guide your implementation over time. And that visit is very important, because we can come in as outsiders and say, okay, these are your gaps and this is what we think, but your campus climate and culture. We don't. And so we need to hear from the team what's going to fly on your campus, because what's going to work at Harvard is going to be different than what's going to work at the University of Rhode Island. So we need to get that information from the team in order to have a strategic plan that's going to be customized to your school. And the plan would be organized again according to that wheel. So these are your goals for life skills. These are your action steps you're going to take to meet those goals, et cetera, for all the domains that you have gaps in. You have a campus advisor who's assigned to the school that really is your guide throughout the whole experience, and during the implementation phase is offering ongoing technical assistance, access to resources, getting you connected with other schools that are in the program that may be working on similar initiatives. There's a whole learning community and online resource library. And tracking your progress and staying with you, tracking your progress on your strategic plan over time, because we don't want you to get to the beginning of year 4, it's a 4-year program, and feel like, oh my goodness, we haven't even looked at that goal that we had set 4 years ago. So tracking your progress over time. At the beginning of year 4, you'll retake the assessments, Healthy Minds and the JED assessment. The JED assessment will be no surprises because you've been tracking your progress. It's the Healthy Minds data here that we're really interested in. Have you moved the needle on students' attitudes, awareness, and behaviors around those very same issues that we've been working on with you systemically? And then continuing to participate as alums in the learning community. So in a nutshell, that's the program. Next. So the other piece that we have been asked more and more to talk about are the impacts of mental health in general for faculty and staff, not just students, but especially this has come to light and people have sort of woken up to the fact that faculty and staff are people too, and also struggle with mental health. That has been highlighted by the pandemic. And so some of the things that I'm sure either you yourself or your colleagues have been struggling with is we all have been running on empty, right? We've been dancing as fast as we can to acclimate to the pandemic. Yes, perhaps we're getting a little bit of breathing room right now, but I almost want to knock on wood when I say that, as new variants seem to be emerging every time I open the New York Times. So just being depleted, just feeling like trying to manage and juggle many things at once, whether it's, if you have children at home or you have aging parents that you're taking care of, how have you been juggling that, especially during the pandemic? But I think we need to recognize that these are things that we all are doing all the time anyway. Maybe not as full-time as when we were potentially working from home and having little kids running around or, dogs barking, which I'm surprised mine aren't. They might be in a minute. So just thinking about all of the multitasking and responsibilities that we're juggling simultaneously, economic hardships that, spouses have lost jobs, some of us have lost jobs. The economic hardship has been tremendous in the implications that has for our lifestyles. Certainly for faculty, transition to technology, and for many, still being asked to utilize technology in a significant way, offering more online classes, dealing with, as you probably have right now during this webinar, Zoom fatigue, worrying about our own health and worrying about coming back to work. As offices are reopening and people are coming back to the workplace, there's a lot of stress and anxiety around, is it safe? Is it going to be, is coming back to the workplace something I feel comfortable doing, and employers really needing to take into account, especially for people who may have underlying medical conditions or other concerns, what kind of flexibility they can offer. We know that our work and home life have been almost one and the same. And so I think it is incumbent upon our higher ed institutions to also be thinking about, let's not pretend that these things only existed during the pandemic. They exist in our daily lives, and we need to not now forget about it because we think things are calming down a bit. So thinking about what kind of flexibility can you offer? How can you be mindful of the many things that might be going on in our staff and faculty's lives? And in particular, I like to just stress not to forget about staff, because I do think staff frequently take a back seat at our institutions, and faculty a front seat all the time. And I think they, I strongly believe that faculty and staff play equally crucial and important roles on our campuses. And I think it's important that our policies and protocols take into account the needs of both groups. Next. Because if we're burned out in the workplace, not only are we at risk, but we're not at our best in helping mitigate any kind of risk that we might be noticing in our students, right? We know that if we're burned out, we become very cynical, critical, irritable. We don't have energy. We're not satisfied with our work. We're disillusioned. We may turn to substances, including food or drugs, alcohol, what have you, not getting sleep, some medical issues. I mean, you, I'm sure, have potentially experienced some of these at some point during, potentially hectic times, or when a lot perhaps has been going on in your personal life. And we know that we are then not only at a higher risk at that point, but again, we're not at our best to help our students mitigate any risk they might be facing. Next. Some causes of burnout here, as you may well already be familiar with these: feeling like you don't have any control of your environment, your schedule, your workload, the resources you need, not being clear about what's expected of you on the job. What kind of authority do you have? What is being expected of you by your manager or your supervisor? Or perhaps you're in a work environment where the dynamics are dysfunctional. Maybe there are personality conflicts in your division, or um, being undermined or micromanaged, or any number of things. Are there extremes in your daily activity? Is it very monotonous or chaotic? Do you have social support? Do you feel isolated? Do you have a reasonable work-life balance? I mean, these are the kinds of things that all can contribute to burnout that we need to be on the lookout for ourselves, for our faculty, and for our staff, who, again, we also need to be concerned about by way of risk. Next. So what can we do? What are some self-care strategies that we can encourage as institutions to try and mitigate some of the risks, whether it be of burnout of faculty and staff, or risks among our students, as I mentioned earlier? And so certainly this is just a very abbreviated list, many of which I'm sure you are well aware of. Building positive relationships, surrounding yourself with people that you enjoy being with, trying to avoid those Debbie Downers in your life, right? And staying around people that you have a positive experience with, building on those positive relationships, certainly making sure that you're getting enough sleep, good nutrition, and exercise. Those are things. And, exercise doesn't have to be, going to the gym 5 times a week, taking a walk, making sure that you're getting up and moving around, instead of, hopefully not sitting at your desk eating your lunch, take a walk during your lunchtime. And play a sport if that's something that you're interested in. There's many ways to stay active without necessarily feeling like you need to go to a gym, although if you do, that's great too. Taking steps to manage your stress, like what is your work-life balance look like? Do you incorporate time for leisure? Do you have time for socialization? It's incredibly important. If our life is only about work, it's going to be stressful and probably not pleasurable. So thinking about how can we balance our work-life leisure time. For some people, it's engaging in their community, doing some kind of community service, whether it's working in a soup kitchen or picking up trash along a riverbed or whatever it might be, somehow engaging in your community. Certainly, so many things now on mindfulness, so many apps that we can have on our phone, and those can range from, a half hour to 5 minutes. I probably should do more of this myself. I preach more than I practice, I'm afraid, but trying to get better at just taking that 5 minutes, whether it's to moderate my breathing or do a short guided imagery, or just pay attention to what's in front of me without distraction, and staying positive, as I mentioned a minute ago. If we can model self-care as if you will, the grown-ups on campus, then that also goes a long way to demonstrating for students the value of caring for ourselves and putting our own mental health and well-being as a priority. What can institutions do? I mentioned this a minute ago when I was talking about burnout, but certainly think about how you can support that work-life balance. Think about schedules that people are asked to keep. What kind of breaks do you offer? What holiday time off do you offer? Do you have time off for mental health and physical health reasons? Folks should be able to take sick time, if you will, or personal days, whether it's for a physical health reason or a mental health reason. Is your policy explicit in that regard? Do you have spaces for staff and faculty to gather? Just as I mentioned for students, but organically for your faculty and staff? Are there communal spaces to gather, to develop connections and have a sense of community? Are there campaigns aimed at reducing stigma? If you have an EAP, for example, or if you don't, does your wellness office also provide stigma reduction campaigns for faculty and staff, promoting your services that you offer to your faculty and staff, physical and mental health services. And really importantly is for managers to be well educated and or trained, if you will, on how to be supportive, how to pay attention to the whole person that they're supervising or overseeing their work. Not just looking at the work product, but noticing how are they doing, inquiring, asking, and being supportive if and when someone that you work with or for or are supervising might need some support. Certainly important to know your campus resources. Some schools have what they call a red folder. Some of you may have those on your campus that for many it's a screen, so the background on your laptop or your desktop with numbers and locations of important offices on your campus. Certainly be familiar with your counseling center resources if you have a counseling center on campus, and if you don't, who do you go to when you notice someone might be struggling or at risk? Where do you report that to if it's not a health or counseling center? Do you have teletherapy on your campus? Do you offer that to your students who may not come to the counseling center or who may be remote? Or just prefer a teletherapy option. Again, the more modalities we can offer to students who are struggling, the more we will capture them and potentially get them the help that they need before they reach a level of crisis and risk. Same with healthcare resources, disability services, knowing about financial aid services. Financial stress is huge. And I was just reading an article the other day about the cost of tuition. Of course, this was at Harvard. It's like $70-something thousand a year. And I think about that, and I think about, a student, maybe not just at Harvard, but at any school where tuition is crazy these days. And thinking about, the loans and am I going to get a job and am I going to be able to pay for this? It can lead to tremendous mental health challenges and tremendous levels of risk. So being aware of where students can go to get support and education around financial concerns. Certainly food banks, what are you doing around food security on your campus, housing security, insecurity on your campus? Do you have emergency housing? Things of that nature. Again, trying to pay attention to some of the underlying conditions that contribute to mental health challenges skyrocketing and potentially putting students at a much higher risk. Next. I am going to leave this to Jennifer, I think, to talk about. These are resources specifically for your cohort. And so Jen, actually, if you're on, maybe you want to jump in and talk about this slide a little bit.
Sure, thank you. So we did want to make you all aware that MEC does have a robust portfolio of services that support student health and particularly mental health. Our mental health program, our student health program at MEC is called MedCare. And because MEC is an interstate compact, as with many of our programs and services, institutions are able to leverage our contracts and our negotiated agreements without the need for their own separate RFP. So we have advisory committees, and in particular, our Student Health Benefits Advisory Committee that conducted the solicitation to select all of these student health services. It was vetted by a community of your peers, and then they ultimately make the contract recommendation to our president. So we have a couple different options, but the two newest options we have in this space that are focused on mental health is Meta-teletherapy and Tau Connect. So we've got the link there on the slides, and then you can find that information on our website as well. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me, give me a call or give me an email, and I can connect you to those resources as well. But those are two very new services that we've introduced for the benefit of our institutions in our MEC member states and also in the member states of our sister compacts.
Great, thank you. And thank you for, that's it for me. So I certainly, I actually don't have a clock, so I'm not sure of the time, but I'm hoping we have time for any questions or comments.
Yes, we do have one question so far. So if others have questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. But the first question comes in is, I'm a library staff member at the college library. How can we support our students in the library?
Great question. So I have a few thoughts about that. First off, of course, as I mentioned, for any faculty or staff member or anyone on campus is, keeping your eyes open and noticing, if you notice any of the students in the library that look like they may be struggling, or if they're coming to you for resources, for example, or direction on finding resources, and you notice that you think something's a little bit off, or perhaps they're really stressed, to offer that question, that warm hand. Hey, are you okay? What's going on? It looks like, you're a little bit stressed out right now. How can I help? But also, I think you may notice, I find that two things. I used to work I was on college campuses my whole life before coming to JED. And one of the places where I was an associate dean, it was an art and design school. And the students used to stay in the studio like all night if we let them, right? And some libraries stay open into the wee hours of the morning. So we made a decision at that institution to close the studio after, I think it was like 1 a.m. or so. It was still late, but, and you could imagine the outroar that happened as a result. But toward the end of really thinking, like, students need sleep, right? They think they don't, but they do. And so thinking about the library, especially, considering your hours, how late are you open? And if you do you see, people repeated, student in the library repeatedly until late hours of the night? Notice who's in your library. What are are there any sort of patterns or trends that you're seeing? Like, this person is here, 3 nights a week till midnight. Is there? Might it be appropriate to say, gee, I notice you're in here a lot. Do you have a lot of work? It seems like you're here for long hours, long stretches of time. Is there any way we might be able to help you, or something along those lines? But keeping your eyes out either for folks that are there for long stretches of time repeatedly, or who may look stressed, or who may come to you for direction.
Great. We have one other question. Can you talk about languishing as opposed to burnout?
Yeah, I think we're all languishing right now, frankly. I think languishing can, if not attended to, can lead to burnout. I mean, that's how I would differentiate them. I think burnout is sort of when we're at our last resort. I think languishing is when we just don't feel like it. It's not where we're so stressed out that, we can't remember what time it is or what day it is, but languishing more, feeling like, if I get to that, I get to that. If I don't, I don't. Just sort of an apathy. Is how I think of languishing. You know, we're not thriving, we're not excited, we're not enthusiastic, but we're also not at the point of burnout where, you know, everything is chaotic and you know, gone to the wind. I think, you know, there's, I don't know if you read this or not, but Adam Grant at UPenn has written some pretty good pieces on languishing that I have found to be really engaging. So I'd also point you to his work.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, and I'm guessing folks would appreciate 5 minutes back on their calendars. But I wanted to thank you in particular, Dr. Roy, for this valuable information that you shared with us all today, and also thank the participants. We at MEC really hope that you found some valuable information that you can transfer back to your campuses. We're here to support you. So in the future, think of MEC or think of the JED Foundation if you have additional questions and concerns in this space. So thank you, everyone, and do remember to take that survey.
And thank you for having me. I did just want to say one last thing, and that is, please go to the JED Foundation website, just jedfoundation.org. There's tons of free resources there that you might find helpful. So, you know, take whatever might apply, but take a look because you might find some things that could be helpful on your campus. And thanks again for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.